Hello friends, for today's video we're going to be looking at episodes 1 through 3 of Arcane Season 1. Just within the opening alone, there's already so much to unpack, and I think that the opening is really indicative of the kind of storytelling that you get within Arcane. One of the things is, I think it is almost undeniable that the visuals in this are incredible, and that's in part, of course, due to how seamless the animation is, and also how the style looks. It's very distinct from so many other shows that were predecessors to it. It really stands out on its own. But on top of that, I feel that they understand the medium with which they are using to tell this story. So there are so many instances within the opening alone where you're not really getting dialogue, you're not getting people explaining the story, you don't have a voiceover as the characters are walking through the aftermath of this violence. You only have visual cues to indicate to you what is transpiring. So right away you see that something has gone wrong. Our characters clearly are devastated. You see it in their expressions. Can't help but feel so much sadness at the fact that you have these two young girls, one of whom is obviously now relegated to the role of caretaker in a lot of ways. And she is leading her younger sister through all of this. She's obviously also doing what she can to sort of shield her from what is going on around them and what has gone on around them. You see Powder is covering her eyes. She doesn't quite understand the full extent of what's going on, and I'll touch on this in just a second as well, but I want to get through why I feel the opening is so well done. You don't just get to see the characters and their emotions and their reactions to things. You also very quickly are seeing a little bit about Vander as well. He clearly had some part to play in this, but when he sees these two young girls who no longer have anyone to take care of them, you see him toss aside his life, both metaphorically and also physically through the representation of what he used as a weapon. You see him set that aside because he recognizes that he now needs to take up this position of a parental figure. Within all of this, you then have the music woven in as well. Without any dialogue, it indicates to you that there is such a distinction between how the people live and are treated within this area and also this sort of far away place where the other half lives, if you will. And you see it as you transition from where they are up through this image of the other area. And the music in this does shift to a much lighter feeling. The ominous and somber tones that it had before then suddenly lift up into something that really tells you and kind of cues to you, look at this sparkling, perfect, almost hopeful dream of a place. Can you imagine what it would be like to live on that side? Also, the positioning where you see it above, off into the distance, and the color usage in this moment really does settle in what the differences are and these stark differences. And then you see Vi's reaction to it, that there is this anger. But the thing that I said I would come back to and how Powder, her reactions to everything are very much looking to Vi almost as a way to ask, what am I supposed to feel? With her being so young, and something that's so devastating about this show in its entirety, but also this opening scene, is the way in which all of the repercussions of this violence, how it affects children, and you so easily, so many of us know that kids often don't quite understand what's transpiring around them. They just have this wide-eyed stare, and they're pulling it in, and they're looking to someone to understand what is going on, and the only person Powder really has to look to now is her sister. And Vi is taking this all in with a little bit more of an understanding, but Powder is just looking to Vi. And I really love that throughout these first 3 episodes, you see this same thing occur so often. It's not just in this moment when Powder is really, really young, but then as she has aged up a little bit throughout the rest of these 3 episodes, she does this same thing again. It's sort of been ingrained in her to look to Vi, to have an idea of how she's supposed to process things. Vi has become her anchor with which she examines all of what's transpiring around her. I think it is done so fantastically. After this, we do have a little bit of a time skip, and this is when things really kick off. You are seeing this ragtag group of kids as they are navigating this area that seemed almost off limits to them, and they are on this mission. They're trying to steal from the wealthy so that they can benefit at least somewhat when they return to their home. I do think that while yes, there are a lot of instances where there is some world building delivered to you via the dialogue, I also find that it's not always extremely direct. We do have instances of Vi bemoaning the state of the world and the injustices of it all, but there's also subtle ways in which the characters and the ways in which they like to showcase their personalities or their interests, you get them through little snippets of dialogue, and right away in the scene, you hear Powder when she's witnessing the airship. She says, "One of these days, I'm gonna ride in one of those." So there is sort of this still, I look toward this way of life with curiosity and almost a sense of envy a little bit, but it's rooted in excitement. Whereas Milo, to juxtapose that very quickly, says, "I'm going to shoot one of them down." And so you kind of establish right away, okay, this is the character that probably has an interest in weaponry, specifically shooting, and then you have Powder, on the other hand, excited about the prospect of learning and understanding how things work. You do, of course, as you get through these first 3 episodes, have these things hit again and again, very much so with Milo. You see in the arcade, he is playing the shooting game, and then you also see that Powder takes a little bit of that on as well. But then you also are seeing the ways in which she's trying to constantly be useful and build things to help the others around her, and she has this really creative streak. And it's funny because it doesn't seem like it's that profound to point out these snippets of dialogue here in their first, really honestly, lines that they have between each other. But it just goes to show that it's not just, oh, look at the kid is playing in the arcade with a gun, look how obvious it is. It's that there are a lot of these things that build over and over, that establish for you who these characters are. Of course, from this moment, we do see that this is sort of the catalyst for the issues that arise that affect our main characters. Something goes wrong as they are stealing these items, and they happen to be stealing from people that are far more important than they ever realize, and that the items they've stolen are far more important than they realized. But once they are on the run and they have managed to escape and return home, there is a fight that breaks out between Vi, her friends, and then this other group of people that have decided this certain area is their area. And you see Powder once again, just like in the opening, witnessing a lot of violence around her and not being able to do anything either to stop it or to help. And this is establishing a pattern where she always feels not only left behind, but she has this feeling of uselessness, like she can't do anything. And it's establishing that she really has a desire to prove herself so that she too can one day be of use. From there, we are more formally introduced to Vander and understand his role not just as the guardian at this point for both Vi and Powder, but also how he fits in with all of the people in his community. I do have a few notes about this, but I actually want to be really respectful of the fact that not everybody who is going to be watching this has watched past episode 3, as some of you, maybe you truly have only watched through the first 3 episodes, or maybe you're following along with the watch schedule that I'm going to be doing. So if you haven't watched past this point, I'm actually going to save my notes for this scene for the end, so that way you're not spoiled. If you are one of those rare individuals who doesn't mind having certain things illuminated for you early, then you of course are welcome to watch that, but I'm going to skip this scene for a second here and then segue on over to Ekko's introduction. Ekko is immediately so precious and such a stark difference in personality to a lot of the other characters we've seen, but once again, you're getting to know them and their personality right away. As I said about the sort of almost throwaway type of dialogue, in this moment you see the first time you're introduced to Ekko, he is fixing something. He's working on something. He seems to have this curiosity and this eagerness to learn. There is some overlap between their characters in this way, and I do feel that that overlap is so incredibly meaningful, as oftentimes throughout stories, you do see characters where maybe originally they start out seemingly similar, and then due to their circumstances, they branch out in different directions. There's almost also this nature versus nurture. How much does your environment impact you? Obviously, they have different caretakers, but both of their caretakers seem to be caring about them, and they do really recognize that they need to be looked out for. So they do at least have some semblance of a childhood. However, this is another thing that I feel I can't comment on until the end. That won't be the situation for every single moment throughout these first 3 episodes, but there is something specifically about the similarities and the overlap between Ekko and Powder. Something I can very quickly latch onto though and just immediately say, oh my gosh, do I hate them, would be the enforcers. Obviously you see one of them has some kind of deal with Vander, and she very much is doing what she can to allow him to basically take care of his own. But this is coming from people above her. They want somebody to put on display to take the fall for what's happened. And so she's just looking basically to make a deal. And she's doing her best to sort of walk both lines. Meanwhile, there's another enforcer that just seems to not be caring whatsoever for the people down here. And so much of this is just represented merely in the fact that when these enforcers are coming through, you see them wearing breathing masks. The idea that the air in this area, that everybody else that you've encountered thus far, they all have to breathe this air. However, when they go down into their side of town, they have to protect themselves. Does it matter to them that this is their day-to-day life? No. And I feel like there's such power in that statement of having them come in, because it just shows how much they value their own health, their own safety, their own selves, but don't regard anybody in this area as being worthy of that level of care. Vander, though, does make very clear, and there's even a direct quote where he says, I can't offer up my own people. He says this specifically to Grayson, and you do very quickly understand that Vander is a very honorable character, but that he is pretty much the only person who is looking out for the best interest of everyone here from a leadership type of role. He is willing to walk a line similar to Grayson. He's willing to meet her where he can, but he is not going to compromise his people for this. Especially in this instance, because the very people he would have to give up are people that are basically like his own children at this point, which he absolutely is not willing to do. And this is when you go to Vi and Powder, and you are seeing the way in which they're sort of wrestling with not only what they've done, but also Vi is starting to take it upon herself to reflect on how her actions and her leadership over her friends and her sister, the cost of this and the consequences of this. And so in an effort to cheer up Powder, who is now feeling really down and feeling like she ruined everything, you see this wonderful moment where they go out into what is basically like a rooftop area, and they're looking out and they're having this really sweet little heart-to-heart. But in this moment, Vi, once again, when she first walks out, you see that she is looking out at this view as she is getting ready to sort of have this sisterly, this big sister moment with Powder. But you see Powder look to her. So I was talking about before in the very opening scene, the way in which you have Powder looking to Vi, sort of trying to understand, how am I supposed to process this? That's my interpretation, at least. Another element is I just am looking for somebody to care for me in this moment, because I have no way of necessarily being able to regulate. I don't have any experiences that have taught me how to handle this situation, so I'm going to look to you. And as I mentioned, this is a pattern of behavior, and this is another example of it, where something that is much smaller in scale than what you see in the very opening, you still find that Powder is looking to Vi. She looks to her before she even looks out at this view before her. She doesn't take that in first, which would be most people's instincts when they walk into an area like this. Vi does tell Powder, we stick together. And in some ways, this is, of course, once again, sisterly love and a big sister looking out for her little sibling. But on top of that, it somewhat mirrors the fact that Vander is also telling Grayson around this same time that he's not going to give up his own people. And I think it's a way to subtly showcase this tether between Vander and Vi. The both of them are constantly looking out for those around them. It just kind of demonstrates that Vi has very much picked up on Vander's way of caring for those and taking ownership over her role when it comes to the people around them. We end the episode with Silco's introduction, and the color use in this scene I think is very notable, as this is already a very ominous, strange, peculiar scene. We do see by the end of this act that Powder and Silco's paths cross, so it's not a spoiler to say that I think very early on there are some indications that there are parallels established from Silco's introduction that show that he is going to be on some kind of path that lines up with Powder's as well. And that path doesn't necessarily just go forward, as we do sort of look at how Silco's past ties to Vander's. We'll get to a little bit more of that later, but segueing out of episode 1 and into episode 2, we return to the scene with the robbery, except for now we're looking at how it has affected our other characters and how this very moment has tied so many of our characters together. We formally are introduced specifically to Jayce and Caitlin. Jayce, we do understand, had this interaction with some magical being or somebody who had the ability to manipulate the arcane, the unknown, magic, essentially. And we do understand why he would have this fascination from this moment. I don't think that this is altogether necessarily particularly subtle, but it doesn't really need to be, because who wouldn't be having a lifelong fascination with magic after a moment like that in his youth? However, we do find throughout these next couple of episodes the way in which this has really become almost all-consuming for Jayce. I will admit, I find Jayce so annoying. I can't stand him, and I think he's even annoying basically as soon as you meet him. I'm getting a little ahead of myself, but I can't help. I feel like I have to explain. Part of it is the fact that he doesn't really look outside himself. He is older than some of the other characters we've been introduced to at this point. Old enough where you would hope that he has an understanding of his own level of privilege and the ways in which he could use what he has to help others. And you think that maybe there's a hint of that in a lot of his motivations. He does seem like he wants to understand magic so that he can improve the lives of others. But you do question how much of that is really true. How much of it is rooted in you wanting to help other people, and how much of it is you just wanting to be able to finally have that craving of curiosity met. You just have to know. And are you justifying that crave for knowledge? Are you trying to act as though the catalyst is maybe more heroic than it actually is? Not that there's anything wrong with just having knowledge for knowledge's sake, but there are so many instances when you look at the differences between how he has been treated as somebody who's in possession of things that he should not have, how he's treated versus the people that broke into his place and how they're treated. Yes, they committed a crime. Yes, they did rob somebody, but he ultimately is the person that had possession of something that caused the destruction. It wasn't Vi, it wasn't Powder, it wasn't Milo, it wasn't any of them that were able to have this level of destruction occur. They were just looking to pocket a few things, and none of this would have really actually happened the way it did and turned into such a huge thing if not for these very deadly, dangerous devices that he had illegally. But he gets basically a little slap on the wrist because he has connections. Meanwhile, we're seeing the entire Undercity is being punished collectively because of something that Jayce himself possessed, which, again, I recognize that there's a lot of nuance here, and it's not entirely his fault that their institutions and their society is set up the way it is, and that it's so unbalanced and unfair, but he doesn't think about it once. He doesn't even a little bit look at the way in which this is happening to other people. He just sees all this happening to him, and he's constantly thinking about how much he's impacted by it, how unfair everything is for him. And you just, for me anyway, I shouldn't say you because I don't know how you feel, but me watching it, I'm like, unfair to you? Unfair to you? What about all these these kids that are taking the fall for the stuff that you had that caused this explosion. It's just, I just wish even once he would hear about what's going on and then be like, well, but wait a second, I thought I had it bad, but this is completely unfair. They didn't mean to cause this. He doesn't think about it at all. Anyway, I digress. Let's get back to our other characters. We return to Vi and Powder and gang, and they are hiding out, laying low, and you see that Vi is practicing within this fighting game. You see that Milo's not that great of a shot, but not only is Powder a great shot, but she's also, you hear, the one that tends to fix everything constantly. But I also want to compliment, even though it's pretty vibrant and not necessarily the most understated color use, I do like that the fighting game matches more so Vi's colors, and then you see the shooting game matches Powder's. Sorry to return so quickly to Jayce, but going back to the events in order. So from that moment and seeing the way in which very quickly their hideout is destroyed because they are being watched and questioned by the enforcers, you then segue on over to Jayce, the complete stark difference between how he's being treated versus the people in the Undercity, and he's being accompanied by Grayson. She does make a face at him at one point that is hilarious to me, and there's a little part of me that's like, is she perceiving him the way I perceive him? But maybe I'm just projecting onto Grayson. But regardless, there is a quote where Caitlyn's mom, who is Jayce's patron, says, I can speak for his character. And it's good to know that there's somebody that recognizes that Jayce didn't have ill intent. He never wanted anything like this to happen, and accidents can happen when dealing with the sorts of things that he has an interest in. However, it's just so unfair that there is nobody to speak up for Vi and her friends. There's nobody to say, hey, these kids, they're just trying to get by. They're just trying to have a little bit so that they can eat and so that they can have some decency. I mean, they probably would have wanted to just use that to have a few good meals. And the difference between the two, once again, is being established really well. We then return to Silco, and very quickly it seems that he is trying to insert himself. He seems to have some kind of background with Vander. We do have light shed on that throughout these first 3 episodes, but at this point, you don't really know why he seems to have such a keen interest in getting involved in all this and how it's connected to Vander, but you do see the way in which he doesn't just immediately go to Vander, he doesn't just immediately find the children who are important to Vander, but rather he finds somebody that he sees he can get an in with, somebody who really wants to crack down on this case, which would be Marcus, and Silco very much recognizes that Marcus is somebody he can take advantage of, and not just take advantage of because Marcus is so wanting to prove himself and be able to exert his dominance and his power over people within the Undercity, because he very clearly looks down at them. But Silco reads him so well, and there's a fantastic quote that says, you carry your chin so high you fail to see the opportunity below. This is both scathing and very accurate. It's also a fantastic way for Silco to pull Marcus in and manipulate him. He is simultaneously insulting him and appealing to something in him and building this curiosity, and it works. And it's so frustrating because you're kind of like, dude, Marcus, you ruined everything. You kind of ruined everything. Back with Jayce, we do have this almost trial occur where we are introduced to some other additional characters, in particular the council. We're seeing how much power they have. You have characters like Mel and Heimerdinger. We do see a little bit more of Caitlyn's mom, as well as just the fact that there are a very small amount of people that are making important decisions for so much of the population. Jayce is finding that the decision that they make, despite the fact that Heimerdinger told him, do not say to any of them anything about magic or the arcane. Keep that to yourself and you'll just get a slap on the wrist. And that wasn't enough for Jayce. He's constantly pushing. And ultimately, in a lot of ways, he's rewarded for this, where other people just sort of have to bow their heads so as to appease those who have more power. Whereas Jayce is kind of in a unique position where he doesn't quite have to do that. And he's never really being punished to the same degree. And one of the things that he does in this moment is he doesn't take Heimerdinger's advice. He does mention things to them. They very quickly decide, no, we can't allow you to continue to do that because it could cause more harm in the long run. Jayce obviously does not take this very well, but his mother intervenes. She speaks on his behalf. He is not ultimately exiled from where they live. He is just no longer allowed at the academy, which of course is a huge blow to him personally. Later, when you see his mother, she knocks on the door. She asks if she can come in so she can speak with him. And he doesn't answer her, which already is irritating me, because he then tells her that my own family won't help me. He says this to her when I'm like, well, first off, she was trying to help you, because he was acting as though, oh, I could have convinced them. And I'm like, absolutely no, you could not. Are you rewriting what transpired? Go from that to the way in which the Undercity is paying the price of everything that is going on. This is when you find out that the council has halted trade, a huge amount of trade, with the Undercities, so they are absolutely fine with collective punishment. Vi has already had to face so much throughout her life. A lot of that feeling of, they tell me through their actions, through the way that they treat all of us, and through the way that they speak to us. She specifically says, I grew up knowing that I'm less than them. And Vander can sense that there's this resistance boiling up in her, and he, in a lot of ways, can see in her a piece of himself, especially the person he was in the past. And as a means almost of trying to warn her, he tells her that nobody wins in war. Despite the fact that Vi very much recognizes this based off of how much she's already lost, how much she has lost has not changed the way in which she has to live, nor has it changed the kind of life that she wants for her sister. She knows that there isn't going to be anything that changes, but she doesn't know how to reconcile these two facts, and she doesn't really know what to do about this, as she's only one person. She's faced the consequences of the actions of those who came before her. She faces the mistreatment pretty much on a daily basis from people that have more than her, but she doesn't know how to ever make anything change. Change is obviously something we have seen Jayce say that he wants to bring about, but a character that we do get introduced to is Viktor. One of my absolute favorite characters, one of the most nuanced portrayals of a lot of things that I can't talk about just yet for spoiler purposes, but Viktor does go to see Jayce. There is a very heartbreaking moment where you see him contemplating what he feels he can live with at this point, if he even feels he can live at all after he has lost what pretty much his entire life has been dedicated to. And you see Viktor approaches him during this very vulnerable moment, and this is when they have this conversation that is built upon a shared interest in his research. Viktor and Jayce kind of immediately have this sort of friendship dynamic between the two of them, but there is a quote that I think is extremely notable in that it seems as though each character is taking something from what the other has said, and they're putting into it their own personality, and they're bringing their own experiences to this interaction without either of them realizing it. Context, we do know that Viktor came from the Undercity similar to our other characters, but he really had to work his way up to this point. So he is in a position where he is similar in his status now to where Jayce is, but he did not get here having the patronage of a wealthy family. He had to really work in a lot of different ways than Jayce has. But there is a quote where Jayce says, "No one believed me." And following directly after that, Viktor says, "Nobody's ever believed in me," which are two very different things. Jayce is saying, nobody believed me. I was saying to everybody, hey, I can make this happen, and they didn't believe it. Whereas I think Viktor thought he was agreeing in a way by saying nobody's ever believed in me. He was almost saying it like in agreement, like, yeah, I'm right there with you. But I don't think Jayce picked up on the fact that they didn't actually agree. They didn't actually say the same thing, because Jayce is kind of too consumed with the fact that he's like, oh yeah, life sucks, doesn't it? And he's not really thinking about what Viktor said or how that relates to Viktor's experience. Meanwhile, Viktor is trying to see something in Jayce that maybe isn't there, by thinking that he's agreeing with him by saying, well, yeah, same here. Nobody's ever believed in me either, is sort of the implication. But it's so different, and it says so much about Viktor that nobody ever believed in him, but he got to this point anyway. So in a lot of ways, he is sort of a very quietly strong, resilient character. But it just breaks my heart because you see so much potential for these two to really have these heart-to-hearts and these understandings of each other, but I feel like in ways they're almost talking over each other accidentally. It makes me quite sad to think about. But then there is another great quote from Viktor to Jayce where he says, when you're going to change the world, don't ask for permission. And I do think that this also sort of bounces off what I was just talking about, where yes, with the purest of intentions, if you want to change the world, and once again, I'm sort of adding an implied for the better into this quote, if you want to change the world for the better, don't ask for permission, because that's how Viktor is viewing things. He knows what he had to go through to get to where he is. He knows what other people in the Undercity are experiencing, and he genuinely, when he says don't ask for permission, it's like, don't ask for permission to do the right thing. Don't ask for permission to use the wealth and the resources and the knowledge that you have to make the world better. The last thing I wanted to bring up for this episode is a quote once again, but this time from Vi to Powder. And I do really love this moment. Vi says to her, what makes you different makes you strong. You see so often just within the scenes from these first two episodes that Powder is feeling less than. I touched on that before, especially when she compares herself to her sister, who is very physically strong. And Powder has said within this chunk that she is not a fighter, but it's really, I think, wonderful for Vi to try and instill within her sister a love of herself and what makes her so amazing. It's just such a sweet moment. It makes me so sad because they loved each other, and I hate that these first three episodes have to end the way they do. But speaking of how these first three episodes end, we will now segue into episode 3. The title for this one is The Base Violence Necessary for Change, which I think very much ties back into that conundrum that Vi found herself in when she's having that conversation with Vander, where she's saying, I have grown up always knowing that I am less than them, but also recognizing that Vander has advocated for peace and that life is in some ways better than it was when she was even younger, but not knowing how to balance those things. And this concept, the violence necessary for change, is I think something, even though it's tied to Silco, it does relate in a lot of ways to that moral conundrum that Vi is experiencing. Because Vi has so much instilled in her through Vander, the idea of accountability and looking after those you love, protect the family, you do see that she picked up on his connection with Grayson, and she decided to try to use that to her advantage to end the collective punishment that everybody is experiencing, and that she will take the fall, especially because she puts on herself that, yeah, I was the one that took part in this robbery, and I don't want everybody else to have to pay the price. I want something better for my sister. And Vander realizes that this is what is going to happen, and so he decides to step in. However, because you've been seeing some dangerous experiments going on with Silco, there are some very violent moments that occur when Grayson and Marcus show up. Vi is locked away and she can't get to it, and that scene is so devastating when she is helpless. When you see Ekko come in, I just love Ekko so much, and when you see him come in and he is crying and the both of them kind of cry together and hold each other, I just feel so bad for them because Benzo was basically like a parent to him. We do finally though see Silco and Vander interacting. We've had some things that are shown to us throughout these first 3 episodes that do indicate that these two have a past and not a very happy one. And you do have this showdown, you can say, between the two of them, or at the very least you're seeing this reunion, this dark reunion between them. And there's something that I wanted to point out that's a very minor thing, but I just wanted to compliment, even though it is so random, which is that Vander, once he's been brought back to this building, Silco goes to crouch down to speak to him at his level, and as he's crouching down, he slicks back his hair, and the motion is just such a realistic thing that I don't know what it is, but I think it's worth noting because So easily the show could have just had him crouch down, but instead to have those very human mannerisms play out, it I think does tell you that there's almost this sense of exasperation, which is great because this moment is followed by a quote from Silco that says, "You'd die for the cause, but you won't fight for one." And that's the thing, is his patience has run very dry with Vander. But I do feel like that's represented right before he says that to him, just through how he is showing physically how he's feeling. Before Vi is able to try and launch this rescue mission for Vander, she does go back and she's telling her friends and her sister what has happened. And this is the third time that I will note that you see Powder once again looking to Vi's reactions to almost, it would seem, gauge how she is supposed to feel about this as well. Obviously, she is old enough to have her own emotions, and she does have her own feelings about what's going on here, and you could argue she's looking at Vi because Vi is talking and telling what's happened. But she doesn't specifically just look at Vi and look at her face and her eyes the way that a lot of other people do when they're having a conversation. Specifically, Vi is clenching her fists, and that's what you see that Powder is looking at and taking note of. And it's through this that Powder determines that she wants to fight, despite the fact that she has already said, "I'm not a fighter," despite the fact that her sister is trying to instill in her a love of what makes her such a valuable person, what makes so much of her personality and the things that interests her so important. Despite all of that, she still returns back to, "I want to fight. I want to be useful." And she is forced to stay behind. And you see the way that this completely destroys her. It very much unravels any sense of worth in herself. She truly feels abandoned in this moment because she can't tag along. She can't go with them. She has to stay behind. But there's so much to this that I've already sort of laid out in talking about all of these little details leading up to this moment. It's not just, I really wanted to help, oh man, they've told me to stay behind. It's not just, I really want to go with them. You don't necessarily hear her say, "Oh no, I am so sad about Vander," or "No, not Vander, I love Vander, he looks out for us." You don't really see that reaction from her. It's, "Don't leave me." She's distraught, and it's because her anchor is being pulled away from her. The whole warehouse scene is so edge of your seat. This is one of those things that the first time I watched this show, the first couple of episodes, I actually thought that, especially the first episode alone, I was sort of on the fence. I think the end of episode 2 is when I really started to feel emotionally connected on my first watch. But the very first episode, I thought, okay, this is a little bit been there, done that. I don't know if it's the most unique and original thing, despite the fact that I do like the animation style. The setting's a little different. I was unsure, especially because when I came to it, it was already so hyped. And there was a few things like the fact that Powder overhears a conversation and then she feels some kind of way. I did like that it didn't just have Powder run off with certain assumptions. It actually had a moment where she, in a very innocent, childlike way, reveals to Vi that she overheard what was being said, and then they actually have a conversation about that, which I liked that there was this, okay, we're going to take the trope of overhearing, which is sort of another version of the miscommunication trope. It sort of took that, and it's like, okay, but they're actually going to have a conversation about it and be open about it. So there were things that were building my trust within the first 2 episodes, but the warehouse scene, I still could not believe, because I thought it was going to play out the way a lot of things do, which are, there'd be these high stakes, maybe they would lose Vander. I didn't want them to lose Vander, but I was so nervous. I didn't know what was going to happen, but I especially was not anticipating the fact, and it's making me kind of emotional to think about, because at this point, every single time I'm like, no, I don't want this to be the outcome. But the fact that Powder accidentally kills her own friends and a lot of people within that building, and that the fact that she did that, she's this little girl that just wants so badly to help, and it is so soul crushing, and I couldn't believe it the first time that I saw it. And then, like I said, every time since, it's like, no, I just want to rewrite this where everybody turns out fine and then everything's okay and everybody lives happily ever after. But this is really when I was like, wow, I have to keep watching. I can't stop here. So the first time I watched this, I had to watch all the way to the end of the season after this moment, because it is so devastating. It's so unexpected. The fight scene is fantastic within it. The way it builds suspense, the way you want to learn and understand more about Silco, there's just so much to it. But there's one element in particular that is, I think, so exceptional, which is just that when you do get these flashbacks between Silco and Vander, and you see sort of that feeling that Silco has as he's losing consciousness, and that he was sort of floating in this water, drowning. And the parallels between that imagery and Powder, when she feels she's finally done something useful because one of her creations actually worked, and she flies off the side of the building, and you get that sort of slow motion of her, and the way it parallels Silco is exceptional. This is definitely an indication of the way in which violence begets violence, the way that you see certain patterns repeating themselves. But one individual who did break their pattern is, you see that Vander I talked about in the first opening scene, the way in which he has changed. He has metaphorically and physically left his old self and his old life and ideals behind for this new life. And I think that you see that all come to fruition in the moment where he starts to strangle Silco, but this time he lets go, even though he knows that it is going to cost him literally what he said. He is willing to die for the things that he believes in. The things he believes in at this point come down to something a lot more peaceful than the vision that Silco has. So to see him actually show up for that and let go of him, I think really does, within this small bit of time we have with Vander, it does show that he really was a man of the principles that he took on. And then, of course, you get not only the heartbreak of their friends being gone, and you see Vander try to protect Vi, but then when Powder shows up and Vi realizes that this was in part because of Powder. And it's interesting because when Powder first comes in, she doesn't even see. So I know I've been hitting this point so many times, but once again, she comes up to her sister and immediately is just excited to say, like, didn't you see? I helped. I did it. I helped. And she's not processing what's going on around her. She's just single-mindedly focused on Vi and getting Vi's reaction. She so desperately in this moment seeks Vi's approval. She has to, in a way, almost, it seems, prove to her sister that, see, you don't have to leave me behind. You don't have to go. And it's not until she starts to see what's going on around her and actually start to process what Vi is depicting in her grief that she really settles into suddenly feeling scared. And you see the physical motion of she's starting to close in on herself, and then she starts to cry, and then she says, "Why did you leave me?" And then this absolutely devastating moment of Vi hitting her, and this repetition once again of the dynamic between Vander and Silco playing out between these two sisters. And the last note I have for all of this is just that Marcus truly did ruin everything, because Vi just needed a sec. She didn't actually leave her sister. She just walked away for a moment and then was going to come back, especially when she sees Silco walking over to Powder. She was going to go, but then Marcus takes her. He says he'll kill you if he sees you. Now, with nobody around, Powder immediately clings to Silco. We can imagine if Powder so often looked to Vi to gauge how she was supposed to feel about things, and almost you could argue her sense of worth, then you can only imagine the ways in which now that is going to shift to Silco. To leave off in this place, this is such a cliffhanger of a way to end Act 1 for this show, but it is an unbelievable first 3 episodes, absolutely incredibly captivating, emotional, and there's so many amazing details throughout this. I did want to touch on a couple of things for those of you that have already seen past episode 3, so if you are somebody who is following along with the watch schedule that I have, you might want to click off, unless of course you don't care about spoilers. The couple of things that I wanted to mention. So I did talk about the ways in which you see the overlap between some of the interests that Ekko has and Powder has, but the way in which your environment can very much impact how things turn out. Of course, if you've seen the rest of the show, you see the differences where Powder becomes Jinx and then Ekko becomes sort of this boy savior. So the two of them, equally innovative and equally talented, but having such a stark difference on the way in which they impact their community. And so that's why I wanted to point out the fact that you do see this creative streak in them and this person that wants to utilize the gifts that they have to fix, but their versions of that become very different. And you could argue that Jayce's becomes incredibly distorted because of the way that she almost, I'll say, imprints on Silco and starts to adopt his way of thinking. Returning to the absolute very opening, though, there is something that I wanted to know as a potential bit of foreshadowing for season 2 that I'll be very curious about. So throughout season 1, you do see after this first act that oftentimes Jinx sort of sees these symbols and she processes the people that she's looking at in a certain way. And in this opening, you see something very similar to that same thing I just described. But we understand by the end of the first season that we associate that with Jinx. But in the opening, you're sort of seeing things through Vi. And you do see these similar, almost like hallucinations occurring. But Jinx, at this point, is Powder, and she is not looking. She has her hand covering her eyes, which then I think lends some credibility to the idea that Vi actually maybe is similarly processing her trauma. It's just not as clear to us, but you see these flashes, especially with the enforcers. And I wonder if in season 2, we're going to see that both of these sisters perhaps have certain ways of dealing with things that are a little bit more alike than we get within season 1. So I'll be very curious to see, especially with how the entire first season ends and the trauma that that's going to inflict on Vi, if we're going to see more parallels between how these two sisters process their trauma. Another bit of foreshadowing that I want to be wrong, but I don't think it is, and I'm so scared, and it's a prediction for season 2, is that having watched the show a few times, I feel like I've picked up on how it foreshadows, or at least I think maybe I do, or I have, excuse me. But the first time that you hear people talk about Vander is when there's that scene where there's that deal going on, and it seems like some of them are going to cheat the other person out of their original deal, and then Vander shows up, and he's like, oh, don't threaten the guy who serves the drinks. You know, there's that whole scene. And one of them calls him the Hound of the Underground. I hate this because I'm so nervous that he didn't actually die, because he looks somewhat dog-like when he has been affected by the substance that Silco has created within the warehouse scene. Almost werewolf-like, so the idea of him being called the Hound of the Underground makes me really nervous that because you don't see him after Vi's been taken away, and then obviously later you see that Silco has sort of taken Powder under his wing and she's become Jinx. You don't know what's happened to Vander's body, and if books have taught me anything, and pretty much any show has taught me anything, it's that if you didn't see the body basically buried or dealt with in some way, that person might not be gone. And the idea of them calling him the Hound of the Underground seems very intentional, and I'm very scared. I do not want him. I mean, I would love if he was alive, but I don't think he's going to be alive as he was, and it's upsetting. I don't like it. There's one other thing that I want to mention that is much smaller, and it doesn't bear the same level of consequences, if accurate. It's just a compliment within this first season for its foreshadowing. But you do see in that scene I was just describing of the individuals that are cutting out the other person from the deal, when Vander serves him his drink, he seems so excited about them. Like, he looks to the drinks in a way that is a little bit more than just like, I'm thirsty, which does, I think, show certain tendencies that he has just within that part alone, which you're going to overlook because he's not a major player in the story at all at this point, nor is he ever. But later on, you do see the way in which drugs have affected him, and I feel like this was a little bit of a clue of certain habits that he has when it comes to substances, which I think is absolutely devastating. Not as devastating as the idea, though, of Vander, of something being with him. I don't want it to happen. Anyway, that's it for this chat through of the first 3 episodes of Arcane. I'm very much looking forward to chatting through the next episodes and then eventually diving into season 2. Thanks so much for watching, though. Of course, feel free to add any additional thoughts in the comments down below. I hope you have a great rest of your day, and I'll see you later.